In our third lecture, we are going to take a look at a lot of the homeostatic imbalances as well as why we have various types of skin color. So we're going to take a look at burns and skin cancers, as well as how we have the different types of skin colors that we do. So to start out with burns, burns basically means that we have had some type of tissue damage to the skin. Usually that means proteins have been denatured. Obviously cells and tissues have been damaged. You can see from the pictures listed there that there is severe damage to the skin, depending on the degree of the burn. When we have a burn, our biggest concern is always going to be dehydration. In the end of our first lecture, we talked about insensible perspiration, right? The diffusion of water naturally in and out of our skin every day without forceful sweating. And so what happens when we no longer have the skin to regulate that, diffusion of water, that insensible perspiration, rate increases dramatically. And so we end up losing fluids, and that causes a whole bunch of issues with a lot of our body systems. Additionally, our water contains ions, if you remember from chemistry, are sometimes called electrolytes, salts and things like that. And when we don't have the fluid to store the ions, those electrolyte numbers go down. That is problematic, especially for our heart as well as other body systems. And then obviously infection. You basically have an open gate to the kingdom. And so lots of different bacteria and viruses can make their way into the body that normally wouldn't be able to do so. So we evaluate the burn severity in two ways. One is through something called the rule of nines. And basically what that means is different parts of the body are allocated different percents. And depending on how much of that body part has a different degree of burn, that is going to indicate what percent of the body has been burned. The other way is the depth or thickness burn. And that's where we get into first, second, and third degree burns, which we will talk about next. So a first degree burn means that you have only damaged epidermal cells or tissue. Basically, it's red. You got maybe a little bit of swelling. That's what edema means, fluid, and maybe a little bit of pain. So first degree burns, sunburn would be a first degree burn. So something where you have the redness, but the severity level is low. A second degree burn means you have burned all the way through the epidermis and into the superficial dermal layer. You can see that pictured on the screen there on the right. Our biggest concern with that type of burn is an infection because we now have made it to the dermal layer, so we can get into blood vessels and lymphatic vessels, and that means that bacteria and viruses can make their way deeper into the body. Second degree burns, could be chemical. They could be a really bad sunburn. Could be the curling iron was on your arm for too long, or you touched something significantly hot, like coming out of the stove and held it there for a hot minute. Usually you see blistering when we get into second degree burns, and definitely that edema, that redness, and that pain. Third degree, as you can clearly see in the picture there, basically all of our cutaneous membrane is gone. All epidermal and dermal layers are no longer present. You can have some really interesting colors. It could be cherry bright red. Sometimes it's blackened. Sometimes it's grayish white, depending on the amount of white blood cells present. Typically, once the burn has occurred, the pain is not present. And that's basically because you no longer have any nerves in that area. They've been burned away. And you typically don't have any swelling because you don't have anywhere to put the water. Usually in a third degree burn, this could be, again, the result of a severe chemical burn, acid burn, usually some type of accident in that way, obviously a fire, a prolonged exposure in that way. Usually you'll need what's called a skin graft. So let's talk about some treatments. Most burns, if not all, need some type of debridement. And debridement means that you are cleaning the area and removing the damaged or dead tissue. And then you are preparing to treat it. One of the ways in which you will treat it is provide fluids, because remember, dehydration is our biggest concern, and then antibiotics to prevent against infection. Obviously, some type of temporary covering, bandages, etc., maybe a salve put over it, and then potentially a skin graft. Skin graft means that you are taking skin from another part of your body and you are placing it onto the burned area. If you look on the top, those critical levels for burns, those numbers don't actually look that big, 25%, 10%, greater than. But that's just how important it is to have our skin intact. You have 25% or more of your body that has second-degree burns. That means that you have access to the dermal layer on a quarter of your body. And that's an issue for not only infection, but for dehydration especially. And for third degree, because you've made it all the way through both layers of skin, even if it's just 10% or above, that's when we are at a critical level. So you don't have to have a huge percent of your body to be significantly burned to have that be a concern. The next area of our skin to talk about is something called skin color. So why we have the kaleidoscope of color, well, I guess not kaleidoscope, but the range of skin colors that we have has to do with a couple of pigments that are located in our bodies and that our melanocytes produce. Skin color is a result of genetics and is related to evolutionary movement of humans over time. Because the one thing that these pigments, especially the primary pigment, which is what we're looking at first called melanin, what it does is that it protects our bodies, our DNAs, with our DNA within our cells from UV radiation and from the sun. So historically and evolutionarily, humans lived in equatorial locations, especially in dry conditions like in Africa. And so people who were the ancestors of all of us would have had dark colored skin and produced lots of melanin because that was what was advantageous to surviving. Otherwise, those people were most likely getting skin cancer or burnt to a crisp and not surviving long enough to reproduce. As people evolutionarily migrated to other parts of the world and had different levels of the various types of pigments that we're about to talk about, they no longer needed to produce melanin. Anything the body does, especially production-wise, costs energy. So if it's not needed, it's going to be phased out. It's going to be selected against from biology class. And so as people started living in areas where it wasn't sunny and hot and dry, and there weren't direct sun UV rays contacting the skin every day, it wasn't necessary to produce high levels of melanin. And so people with less melanin produced were being selected for in those areas. And so you ended up with people with lighter skin colors. So let's talk about the actual anatomy and physiology of how that happens. So the first pigment that you're looking at is melanin, and melanin has a couple of different shades. You have a reddish yellow or a brownish black pigmentation based on, again, DNA. And that melanin is produced by those cells called melanocytes. Basically, what happens is that the melanocyte produces the melanin and it releases it into keratinocytes via melanosomes, basically little packages that are sent, like Amazon, from the melanocyte to the keratinocytes. And basically, somebody who has darker skin is going to have larger and more numerous melanosomes. So the more packages, they contain more melanin. And then you're going to end up with a darker skin tone. Again, the primary reason why melanin is so important is that it protects from UV radiation. We want some UV radiation. I'll talk about that at the end of class today, or at the end of the lecture today. But a lot of exposure to UV radiation will damage DNA, will cause cancers, which is something else that we'll look at today as well. The second pigment that influences and mixes in with the melanin to produce skin colors is keratin. And keratin is an orangish yellow pigment. Typically, we find this in any type of orange vegetable, so like your carrots. Basically, what happens is it accumulates within your epidermal cells, sometimes also deep in the dermis as well as the hypodermis. And basically what happens to keratin is it can be converted into vitamin A, which is something that we need, one, to keep the epithelial cells healthy and functional. But two, it also impacts the pigmentation and receptors within our eyes. That's why they always tell you that carrots are good for your eyes. Here you can see visually, zooming in on that stratum basal. Here we can see our basal layer, and you can see these little granules that are in that kind of brownish yellow-red pigmentation. And even over on these are a little bit more active in producing their melanin. Those are our melanocytes. And then here is, in the cartoon version, here is your melanocyte. There's that pigment. All right, and you can see a little pinching off here and here. Those are our melanosomes. So those are those little Amazon packages filled with melanin that are going to release and travel into our keratinocytes, and then as they make their way to the skin, are going to be containing that melanin, that pigment. It's going to provide us with the skin color that we have. Now, those melanocytes are also going to be stimulated by UV radiation. So if you are in the sun more, your skin is going to be, even if you are fair-skinned, your skin is going to be triggered to produce more melanin to try and protect you from that radiation that you are being exposed to. And that's why lighter-skinned people will tend to freckle or tan when they are in the sun. And basically all that tan is really saying is that you're overworking your melanocytes to try and protect your DNA from harmful UV radiation. In addition to those two pigments, your skin is also influenced in terms of its color by hemoglobin, basically your blood flow through your blood vessels near your skin. Hemoglobin is the protein found within blood, and it carries oxygen. When hemoglobin has oxygen attached to it, it is a bright red color. When hemoglobin does not have oxygen attached to it, it is a very, very dark red color, like a wine red. At no point at any time in your entire existence is your blood blue. We'll have this conversation in class. But it is always red, and it just depends on the presence of oxygen to determine the shade of red. The reason why there is that misunderstanding about blue blood is because when someone has less oxygen than they need, they're extremely cold, they're not pumping enough blood, whatever the case may be, they may appear bluish, especially lighter-skinned people. And the reason being is that the combination of the red, yellow, or brown-black melanin and the yellow-orange keratin in your skin, when you filter through and you look and see your blood vessels carrying deoxygenated blood, it tends to appear blue through that filter of those other pigments. But at no point is it actually blue. But that bluish tint to our skin is called cyanosis. And that's a clue that you are either lacking in oxygen, or you're really cold, or maybe you have severe asthma. In some way, shape, or form, you're not receiving the oxygen that you need. There's a few other conditions, and this is not an exclusive list, but just a couple of common things that do result in alterations of your body color, your skin color. Jaundice is a pretty common one, and you see that in babies or people with liver disease. Basically, what happens is the whites of their eyes and their skin tends to have a yellowish color, and that's due to buildup of bile from the liver. There are two hormonal or endocrine-related conditions, pituitary tumors or Addison's disease, and you can see that there's two different types of hormones that are produced in excess. And as we know, hormones are controlling these types of things with our skin, and so that can result in some alteration with melanin production. And then lastly, vitiligo, which is pictured in the corner there, where you basically lose melanocytes, so they die off. And so you no longer are producing melanin as you were, and that can tend to be splotchy. And so you see those areas of the skin that are not producing melanin like they should. All right, one of our last main topics here is skin cancer. So going along this line of UV radiation and our skin interacting with that, skin cancer is a huge concern and fairly common in a lot of people. Especially nowadays when people are looking for that tanned look for whatever reason. Most skin cancers tend to be benign. So the majority of skin cancers are basal cell carcinomas, which is the first cancer listed there. About 80% of skin cancer cases are basal cells, and they are the least malignant. Malignant means bad, so they're the least bad, and they don't metastasize. Metastasize means that the cancer from wherever it originates leaves, travels, and goes to another location and continues to overdivide. All right, cancer, if you didn't learn in biology class, is uncontrolled cell division. So basically, the cells don't know when to stop, and they keep dividing and dividing and dividing until you have a huge clump of them. We call those clumps tumors. In a basal cell carcinoma, it is the stratum basal cells, so that one line of actively mitotic cells in the epidermis. And basically, they leave the epidermis and they go down into the dermis or hypodermis. And what happens is you end up with these little nodules. They tend to be fairly slow growing and don't metastasize often. And usually a quick surgical excision can remove that carcinoma. And usually you don't have any other concerns as long as you regulate your UV exposure. The second type is squamous cell. Squamous cell carcinoma occurs in keratinocytes, which is primarily located in the stratum spinosum of the epidermis. And basically, these carcinomas tend to usually be on the face area and sometimes the hands. And they're usually little red nodules or little papules, but these are fast growing, all right? They tend to grow pretty fast. Usually you need some type of surgical excision to remove them, again, for treatment, and then usually some type of radiation, just to make sure that it hasn't metastasized if you didn't treat it early enough. But the most concerning type of skin cancer is the least common, but that is melanoma. Melanoma is highly, highly metastatic, meaning that it will leave the area. Those cells will leave the melanocytes in the skin, and they will jump in the blood vessels, and they will travel to another area of the body, and they will continue to produce and develop tumors in those areas of the body. Melanoma tends also to be resistant to a lot of chemotherapies, which makes it difficult to treat as well. Basically, what you see with melanoma are patchiness on the skin. And like I said before, it usually quickly metastasizes, oftentimes into the blood vessels, but into the lymphatic vessels as well. And that can be pretty dangerous because then it can lead to lymphoma, which is another concerning type of cancer as well, because it can travel through the body, through those vessels. Obviously, melanomas you want to surgically excise. Usually some type of immunotherapies or potentially radiations usually can do some help if caught early enough. There are 5 early detection helpful tips, alphabetically listed here, A, B, C, D, E, that can help to increase survival rate with any of these types of cancers, but most especially melanoma. Basically, the bottom line is to know your body, all right, especially if you're fairer skinned, so you are more susceptible to skin cancers because you don't have as much melanin. You want to be aware of all your freckles and your moles, and you want to make sure that they don't do any of these things. You don't want them to be asymmetrical. If your moles or your freckles don't match, if they're weird shapes, those are a concern. You want to keep an eye on them. You don't want them to have irregular borders. So you can see the picture there. That is not a nice little circle. That is a weird looking shape that you could come up with a name for. You want to keep an eye on those. You don't want their color to change. Something that's multicolored or that changes color is a concern. All right. You don't want the diameter to be very large. All right. Or you don't want it to change. So that's why you want to keep an eye on those moles and freckles. And then you don't want them to evolve. So any changes in any of your moles and freckles over time is a concern. And you want to have a dermatologist take a look at it immediately to ensure that it is not malignant and it's just a benign issue that can be removed. Lastly, for today's lecture, we've talked about all these bad things that happen from UV radiation, but there is one good thing, and that is that UV radiation helps the body to produce vitamin D, all right? Helps to produce vitamin D. And so by producing vitamin D in the skin, that happens through the epidermal cells being exposed to UV radiation, so getting out in the sun. What happens is that vitamin D then travels to the liver and the kidneys, and those 2 organs, technically 3 organs, convert that vitamin D into calcitriol. And basically calcitriol is used and important, essential for part of our absorption process in our intestines as part of digestion. And that provides absorption of key minerals that our body needs to be able to function. If we don't have enough vitamin D, so if you don't get that UV exposure that you need, it could lead to a condition called rickets. And you can see one of the common clues that someone has rickets is that bowing of the legs. You tend to see that, kind of weakening because of the lack of ability to absorb calcium into our body.